Well, hello there. My family's made a momentous decision. We are leaving Missouri and heading out to California. Now, all of our friends and family say, why would you want to make a trip like that? You already own a farm. All your friends are here. Even your parents are here. Well, this past winter decided it for us. We had the harshest winter in history out in Missouri. It was below zero most of the time. It froze overnight, and I lost several head of cattle. The ground was so hard I couldn't even plow it till late spring. That means I couldn't get a crop in. I lost half my planting season and half my profits. Another reason was we wanted to live in a more healthy climate. We live on the Mississippi River, and our summers are sweltering hot and humid, and that's just a breeding ground for some of the most deadly diseases there are, like malaria, cholera, and smallpox. So those are pretty good reasons to decide to leave, and we're going to be on our way. All you have to do is decide how you want to get there. Well, there's a couple of different ways you can go. If you got the money, you can buy passage on a big ship and sail all the way down to South America, go around the Horn and up through the Pacific side of the continent, end up there in San Francisco. Another way you can go is you can go by covered wagon, and that's what we've chose to do. So I've purchased this sturdy covered wagon here. It's made of oak. It has 4 wheels with steel rims around them so it can travel on rough ground. It's got these metal hoops with a canvas cover over the top so you can put a lot of cargo inside. Now, in the bed of the wagon, we're going to put all our heavy equipment. Things like I've got a 1-horse plow I'll put in there, all my farming equipment like scythes and shovels and rakes and pickaxes and all the things we need to get a farm started. That'll be in the base. The wife also has a cast iron stove she wants to take along. It's a little heavy too. So certainly one of the most important things we got to take with us is food. But the wagon isn't nearly large enough to take food for a 5-month trip. It's over 1,000 miles long. In fact, we'll have food just enough for the first few weeks. So where do we get the rest of it? Well, hunting is the primary way we're going to do it. And children your age are taught to hunt and use rifles. What we expect to see out on the prairie is hopefully buffalo and elk and deer. So by hunting, we'll be able to supplement most of the food we need to eat and stay healthy. So we also expect to be able to trade with the Native American people. Now we're bringing a lot of trade goods with us. Things like these beautiful warm wool blankets and all kinds of trading knives. Now the Indian people know how to make a beautiful knife. They make it out of obsidian, which is a volcanic glass. Oh, it's sharp as a razor, but what happens to glass when you drop it? Of course, it shatters. So we're bringing with us literally a barrel full of skinning knives like this one. Now, once you have a nice wagon like this, you got to decide how you're going to pull it. Now, there's a few choices, of course. You can use horses. They're certainly strong enough. They've got the endurance, but when you get up into the high country and start pulling hills, they just don't have the strength. And our choice is oxen. Now, an oxen is a bull, cattle. Female, of course, would be a cow. I've purchased 6 oxen, and I expect that they'll be able to take us all the way to California without any trouble. So this is a pretty risky trip. First of all, it's an awful long way. It's 1,500 miles, 5 months. That's 150 days on the trail. What makes it also pretty dangerous is it's unknown territory. See, there's not a lot of explorers that have been out in this country before. They haven't made any good maps. There are no travel journals that anybody's written, so there's no directions on how to get there. Now, I've solved that problem by hiring a real good man as a trail guide. His name's Wilkerson, and he's made this trip several times before. He says he knows the way. He can get us there, and he can get us there safely. He knows where the water holes are. He'll be following the rivers, so we always have grass for the animals to feed on. Now, I mentioned hunting. Children your age were taught to hunt. In fact, my daughters are real good shots. One of my favorite weapons for hunting is a Hawkeen rifle. You load it with gunpowder from a horn like this, and you pour the gunpowder down the barrel. Then you take the steel bullet, put it on top. You pull out the ramrod, force it down the barrel, tamp the gunpowder and the bullet down, put a percussion cap, that's an igniter, goes here under the hammer, cock the weapon, and it's ready to fire. Now, a Hawking rifle shoots a big slug. It's powerful enough to take down a buffalo, certainly an elk or a deer. So there are plenty of chores for the children when we're on the trail. And one of the big ones is finding firewood for the campfires. Well, the open prairie doesn't have any trees, so there isn't any firewood. We need to find a substitute for firewood, and that is cow pies and buffalo chips. Now the children, as they're walking alongside the wagons and they're leading all of our other animals we're taking with us, they got a nice little bucket. And all along the way, they're gonna find these nice dried cow pies. Now you might think that's a pretty icky thing, but it's not. It's been drying out in the sun for years. And after all, it's just old dried grass. It doesn't have any smell at all, but it sure burns good. So the kids at the end of the day, they can dig out a nice little fire pit, load about 50 or 60 of those cow pies, and they get it lit up, and boy, it makes a nice little fire. And I have to tell you, it's got no smell unless it's smoking. If there's a little bit of smoke coming off of there, sometimes Mom's muffins taste a little funny after they've come off the fire. Now this journey mostly is going to be across the Great Central Plains. And that's a long way and a long stretch to pull. We're going to be on that trail for a mighty long time, months. Now what makes this journey a little dangerous is when we come to the mountain passes and the rivers. You see, oxen and horses naturally can swim, but other animals that we're bringing with us, they can't. And when the oxen are connected up to a wagon and pulling, if they go across a river and a fast stream pushes a wagon over, it'll drown the oxen. So the way we solve that problem is we unconnect them, take our harnesses off, and we lead the oxen to cross individually. Then we fasten up big ropes to the wagon and haul it across the river by pulling them with our horses. Mountain passes are a whole nother problem. When we get to the high Sierras, there are a lot of boulder fields and there are deep ravines. The wagon can't possibly make it through that kind of territory. So the solution is you take all the cargo out of the wagon and you pack it on your back all the way up the hill. What do you do with the wagon? You got to take it all apart and haul all of it up there. Individual wheels and then the wood sides and the canvas top is all got to be handled on your back, walking up that hill, then reassemble it and head down the other side. Now once we leave the Great Plains, we have to cross the great dreaded desert of Nevada, and that's a long, long stretch. It'll take us a better part of 3 weeks to get through it. Our trail guide, Mr. Wilkes, knows how to travel in the desert. He has us up really early in the morning, even before the sun's up, when the air is still cool. Now we'll travel till about noon. Then we'll take a 2 or 3 hour break. We rest our animals, give them a chance to have some water, hopefully find a little bit of grass they can nibble on. We'll all cool down so we don't overstress them or overheat them. Later in the day, we'll start up again. Hopefully when the sun is starting to set, the air gets a little cooler, it's a little easier to travel, and we'll make it till about sunset. And then we'll stop and make evening camp. Now leaving the desert, we're looking for a milestone, and that is the Great High Sierra Mountains. That's going to get us pretty close to California. They're right on the border between Nevada and California. But the Great Sierra Mountains are a real challenge. The most important thing about getting over those mountains is getting there before winter snow. If we can't get over the mountains before it snows, we are in real trouble. There is no food on the desert, and we'd have to wait the entire winter to get over, and that's not very likely. Most teams that don't get to the Sierras before it snows turn around and go back home. Now, we'll arrive early enough, I can guarantee you that. And once we get over those high Sierras, we're going to be looking down into the Sacramento Valley of California. Oh boy, was that going to be a special day. And our reference point is going to be this big old mountain called Mount Diablo. That's where we're heading to. Mount Diablo is the place where we plan to build our new farm in a little town called Brentwood. I will meet with a land agent. He'll show me the land that's available, and I'll pick out a really nice spread. Then with our friends, we'll all start new farms and new lives in a great state of California. So I hope to meet you out on the trail someday. And until then, adios, amigos. Until we meet again.
Welcome to the Byer-Nail House, the museum of the East Contra Costa Historical Society. This museum is all about the local history of Brentwood, Byron, Knights in Discovery Bay, Oakley, and Bethel Island. Today we will be sharing with you historical items, buildings, and activities that will take you back in time to the 1880s to show you how life was here on the farm and help you understand how this area was settled by pioneer families. John, his wife Letty, came to California from Iowa by covered wagon along the Overland Trail in 1863. You will be hearing the stories inside the house about life here in the 1880s. No electricity, no running water, and no inside bathroom. Our tool shed will show you how farming developed from open wheat fields to the crops you see today. Chores was an essential part of a family farm in the 1880s, and everyone was responsible to do their chores. Chores started at sunrise, and they consisted of pumping water from the well into buckets, bringing it over to the porch, bringing wood inside the house to heat the stoves, gathering eggs, milking cows. After chores, got cleaned up for breakfast and off to school. If you heard the school bell starting to ring, you better hurry up. You didn't want the school mom to be upset at you. Once back home, more chores. Some of the chores from the morning had to be redone, and you had your afternoon chores, and don't forget your homework. Some chores had to be done whenever needed throughout the week. Gathering, chopping wood, stacking it, washing clothes, hanging them out on the line, ironing, folding, and putting them away. Now, one of the most important times of the week, Saturday afternoon, bath time. And this consisted of a large metal tub on the back porch. And now the bath order was mom and dad go first, then the kids from oldest to youngest, all in the same water. Imagine how dirty it was at the end. Whole family was clean at this point for Sunday church and a day of rest, and the whole week starts over on Monday. Oh, I hear Blue, our only resident of the museum. He's calling out and showing his train. And those are his long, colorful feathers, telling us it's time to transport back to the 1880s to learn about life here on the farm and our local history. Thank you for sharing this time with me.
Good morning. Welcome to the Byer-Nail House. This house is fairly typical of a farmhouse you would find in this rural area in the late 1800s. From the outside, it's a simple box shape, and inside you have small square rooms with a screened-in back porch off of the kitchen. And as typical in the time when this house was built, there was no electricity or running water in this house. But you'll also notice that this house is a bit larger than a typical farmhouse built for a family. That's because it was originally built as a boarding house by Johnson Fancher in 1878. At that time, people were traveling to this area to either homestead land to farm or to work in the wheat fields, which could be found from the foot of Mount Diablo out to the rivers of the Delta. But travel to this area was difficult and long. If you were coming from the east coast of the United States, you could travel across land by wagon, by stagecoach, by horseback, or even by foot. Or you could travel by boat and come down the Atlantic coast of the United States, down around South America, up the Pacific coast, all the way to San Francisco Harbor, where you could board a smaller boat and come in through the rivers to this area. This travel made it difficult, but there was a major event going to be happening soon that would be bringing more and more people to this area. And Mr. Fancher knew that if more people were coming, there were few towns, no homes, and they would need a place to live. And so he built a boarding house because that huge event was known as the railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad had just been completed in 1869, and in 1878, that railroad was being branched off to connect the larger cities and towns throughout this area. And the San Pablo and Tulare Railroad was building its link from San Francisco to Martinez to Point of Timber to Banta, which was in San Joaquin Valley. And the section of railroad between Martinez and Point of Timber was going to be right here where he was going to build his boarding house, which would make a perfect stopping point for people to be able to get here. Point of Timber at that time was the largest settlement in this area. It had a post office, it had a general store, it had a blacksmith shop, and the Point of Timber landing was the biggest shipping point for the farmers in this area to ship their cattle and grain to market by the river. But you don't hear about Point of Timber today because somewhere along the way, someone in Point of Timber and the railroad got into a bit of a little tiff somehow, and the railroad moved their plans for their tracks from right here, 5 miles west to where the smaller towns of Brentwood and Byron, and they built their train stations there. Well, as the railroad took power and more goods were being shipped and more people were traveling by railroad, the shipping went away and the towns of Brentwood and Byron grew, and the Point of Timber became less important and basically disappeared. At that point, there was no railroad, no way for people to get to Mr. Fancher's boarding house. So he sold it to the John Richard Byer family in 1883, and his family lived here until it was donated to the East Contra Costa Historical Society in 1986 to become a museum for our local history.
Welcome to Homer's Tool Shed. It's named after Homer Beasley, who was a local Brentwood resident who was one of the early members of the museum, and he donated many of the tools and items which we have here on display. The wonderful exhibit that we have here tells the story of how this beautiful valley was transformed by the pioneers who moved into this area starting 150 years ago. Long before any settlers arrived in this area, it was in wide open spaces leading up to Mount Diablo on the west side of our valley. The original inhabitants were Native Americans, members of the Yakut, Miwok, and Ohlone tribes that lived in small villages scattered around the valley. By the time the Nail family purchased this home, there were small farms dotting the area, many of which were growing wheat, which was shipped by boat to larger towns to be sold. The many rivers in our Delta area made this the fastest way to ship goods. Harvesting wheat is very difficult work, and it was cut using long-handled tools called scythes and grain rakes. Then it was taken to a barn where the farmers would use this tool, which is called a flail. After the wheat is brought in from the field, you actually spread the cut wheat on the floor and then beat it with the flail to knock the grains of wheat off. Then you sort the grains out from the stalks and put the grain into bags that you take to a miller who would grind them into flour, which can now be used for cooking. This was extremely difficult and very hot work. During this time, many farmers in the area started to grow other kinds of crops, including sugar beets, corn, tomatoes, and lettuce. There were also dairies in the area that produced milk to ship to larger cities by railroad. At one time, 6 Knightson dairies shipped 2,500 gallons of milk by train each day to the Bay Area. In order to plant a crop, you first have to prepare the land itself, which is done by plowing. Our horse is attached to a single share plow. A share is the name of the pointy metal piece that digs into the ground. The farmer would have to pull up on the handles to make the share dig into the ground. It would be possible to plow about 2 acres of land a day with this plow, which is about the size of the property where the museum is located. A riding plow was much less work for the farmer. Of course, after the land has been plowed, you have to plant the seeds for the crop. A very early type of planting is called broadcasting, where you would carry a sack of seeds around your neck, and as you walked through the field, you would throw handfuls of seeds in an arc in front of you. The statue of the farmer in Brentwood City Park is of a man doing this type of planting. Then a new invention called a mechanical broadcaster was created, and you could wear this device around your neck and turn a handle, which would throw the seeds for you. Some crops, unlike wheat or alfalfa, are called row crops, and they have to be planted in neat rows. Believe it or not, this is a corn planter. You would fill this compartment with grains of corn, and as you walked down a plowed row, you would stop after every step and push the tip into the ground and pull on this lever. Each time you did it, a corn stalk was being planted. In order for the crops and flowers to grow, they need to be pollinated. Do you know what insect is most useful for this? Of course, it's a bee. And what do bees make? Yep, they make honey. So another thing many farmers still do is to raise bees. This white box is called a bee box, and you'll see lots of them in many farm fields as you're driving around with your mom and dad. Inside the box there are these wooden trays. This plastic grid is where the bees leave the honey. When the trays are full, you can collect it. Although you could scrape a lot of it off, much would remain in the honeycomb, so instead you use this device, which is called a honey separator. You place the trays in it like this, and then you spin the handle and the honey comes out on the sides of the barrel. It runs to the bottom and then out this valve into the containers. One other thing about bees, every beehive has to have a queen, and if you don't have a queen, you can't have a hive. Look at this little box. It's made of screen and wood and has 2 holes in it. If you live in an area that doesn't have many bees and you want to start a hive, you have to get a queen. These are queen bee shipping boxes. In the old days, you could contact a beekeeper who sold queens, and he would put one into this little container. He'd put a cork in this hole and a sponge soaked in sugar water in the other. Then he would wire a mailing label to the box and send it to you in the mail. That sounds kind of funny, but even today there are beekeepers who will ship you queen bees using either UPS or FedEx. Most farmers kept a cow or 2 for producing milk. Although on many farms milk was brought directly to the kitchen in a pail for mom to use, some farms had one of these. After milking the cow, a chore was to bring the milk in this metal pot and dump it in. It looks like a cooking pot, but it isn't. If you turn the handle here, it actually separates the cream, which comes out this spout, from the milk, which comes out down here. For quite a few years, these were the kinds of crops that were being raised here, and this kind of farming was called sky farming because it relied on rainwater for the crops. As a result of this, from the middle of the summer until the first rains in the early winter, not much was growing because it was too hot and too dry. But 2 young men, Robert Balfour and Alexander Guthrie, who had traveled from England to seek their fortune in California, came to this area and totally changed the way crops are grown. When they first arrived here in 1882, they were impressed by the large wheat fields and with the quality of wheat that was grown here. So they built warehouses in both Brentwood and Byron where the farmers could sell their crops. These crops were then transported by train to their warehouse in Port Costa on the Sassoon Bay. The Sassoon Bay leads to the San Francisco Bay, which in turn leads to the Pacific Ocean, and that allowed them to ship their wheat all over the world. But that was not the only impact they had on our area. In 1910, they purchased the Marsh Ranch, which spanned from the base of Mount Diablo all the way to the river. Within a 2-year period, they developed irrigation canals and pumping stations connecting to the river at Indian Slough, which supplied readily available irrigation water to farms throughout the area. And soon wheat began to be replaced by orchards, including apricots, plums, peaches, pears, cherries, walnuts, almonds, and pistachio nuts. Balfour Guthrie built packing sheds to pack their produce for transporting by train. They built cutting sheds next to drying lots where the cut fruit could be dried and shipped around the world. Some years, over 600 people were hired just to cut fruit, and each year over 30,000 trays of dried fruit were processed by Balfour Guthrie. Balfour Guthrie created camps to house the workers. The largest of these camps was called the BG Camp. It had cottages and tents and offered electricity, community kitchens, showers with hot water, modern latrines, and pure running water. It housed over 1,000 workers and had a nursery school for 150 children. It was later called a Blue Goose Camp. In 1931, Blue Goose Camp was named the best operated farm labor camp in the United States. The Balfour Guthrie Company literally built the town of Brentwood. They created the city's water and sewer systems, paved many of the streets, instituted the telephone system, and built the Brentwood Hotel and the Bank of Brentwood. The Balfour Guthrie Company established a canal system, utilized the railroad to transport goods to the large warehouse in the bay for shipping around the world, and transformed this area from sky farming to irrigated farming, which is still going on today. There is much more to look at in Homer's Shed than we've presented on this video. There are lots of other fascinating pieces of history that tell the story of the development of the area.
We're standing in the parlor of this home, and this is where families would have gathered in the evening after their dinner and after their chores were done for the day to have a bit of leisure time before going to bed. Now, with no electricity in this home, that changes what happens in this parlor. So, if you had a family member who played the piano, you could have listened to music or sing in the evenings. And no, you would not find two pianos in a parlor in a typical home, but this second piano does have importance to a history of our area. It was donated by the George Knight family. George Knight was a farmer who moved to this area in 1883. George Knight owned land, and again, the railroad came to play in the history of our area because the other railroad line, the Santa Fe Railroad, was going to build their tracks from Oakland to Stockton. And that track was going to go directly through George Knight's land, which he didn't want to have happen. So he negotiated with the railroad company and said, I will donate the land to you to build your train station if you build it over on the side of my property, which they agreed to. Well, it needed a name. So they took George Knight's last name and his wife's last name, Christina Christensen, and combined them and made the name Knightson. That became the name of the post office, became the name of the train station, and the name of the town that now sits in that area. You could also have enjoyed reading in the evening or playing board games such as checkers or chess or playing dominoes or card games. But remember, there was no electricity in this house. So to have light in the evening when the sun was going down, you would use a kerosene lamp. It has a tank that has the kerosene, which is a flammable liquid. It has a cotton wick that is raised to make a higher flame or lowered to make a smaller flame, and a glass chimney that protected that flame. Kerosene lamps were used in the rural areas until the 1940s. At the turn of the century, you may have enjoyed music from a talking machine. This is a symphony talking machine. It has a crank on the side that winds up a spring inside. And when that spring is released, the turntable turns and plays some music for your entertainment. This talking machine actually has an internal speaker, which was an improvement from its earlier model that had a large horn on the outside to amplify the sound. Another activity that may have been happening in the evening would be Mom sitting at her treadle sewing machine, mending or making clothes for the family. The women of the household were responsible for making and taking care of all of the clothing for the family and keeping them in good repair. Of course, the focus was always on durability and function, not so much fashion. Clothing that children wore were passed down from older to younger to younger to younger children until there were no younger children that needed them, or they were so worn out that they could no longer be mended and repaired. At which time, it wasn't thrown away, Mom would remove the buttons and save them for another time and cut up that fabric to make quilts for the beds, or she could have torn them into long strips and braided them together to create a braided rug for the floor of the house. A darning egg would also be found for Mom to repair socks, as would embroidery hoops for needlework for her to add decoration to items in the household. All girls were expected at a very young age to be able to sew, to mend, and to do decorative needlework. But those weren't the only skills that young girls were expected to learn. And there was no room that had more skills to learn than in the kitchen, which was the hub of every household.
Welcome to the kitchen. This was the heart of the home during the 1880s. Mom spent many hours here preparing food for her family. The family farm raised wheat and produce for market. They also raised the majority of their own food. Mom would usually have a garden for vegetables and fruit, as well as raising chickens for eggs and meat, pigs for meat, and cows for milk and meat as well. Fruits and vegetables were canned or preserved during the summer and fall in order to provide nutritious food for the family during the winter time. Women worked many hours over a hot stove to provide this food for their families. Food was cooked on this wood stove, which meant that wood had to be brought in the morning from the outside. This was usually a chore for one of the children before they went to school. There was no running water in the house in the 1880s, so water had to be pumped from the large pump in the front yard and brought into the kitchen in large pots. It would then be heated on this stove. Also, there was no running water in this home, so therefore the family had to use an outhouse for their bathroom. Washing clothes was a time-consuming job. Water had to be pumped out of the pump in the front yard and brought in to be heated on the stove. It was then put into two different tubs, one for washing with a washboard, such as this, and a bar of soap. The clothes were then hung out to dry on a line outside if the weather was nice, or inside on a drying rack if the weather was cloudy or rainy. Cows were milked usually twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. This was often the job of one of the kids. Farm families had to make their own butter. Butter was made by skimming the cream from the top of milk from the cows. It was placed into butter churns, and I have 3 examples of different types of butter churns here. This is an old-fashioned butter churn in which the cream was placed inside the crock and the cream was pounded into butter. This butter churn, the cream was placed inside this cylinder and this hand crank was turned and it beat the cream into butter. This one also is similar in that it has paddles inside and a crank was turned and the cream was beat into butter this way as well. There was also no electricity in this house, so therefore they did not have a refrigerator. They had an ice box, and an ice box looks like this. It has a top portion that held the ice and a portion down here that held the food. Now, the ice came from up in the mountains. It was either cut from lakes that were frozen and brought down on horse-drawn wagons or by train. An iceman in a horse-drawn wagon would come and deliver the ice to the different farmhouses. He would cut the blocks of ice in small portions and bring them into the house and place them in the top portion of the ice box. Mom would prepare most of her food here at this work table. She used many of the same utensils that we use today, such as this rolling pin, cookie cutters, cherry pitters, and muffin pans. Thank you so much for being with me today in the kitchen. I hope you enjoyed our tour and that you learned something about farm life in the 1880s.
Welcome to the upstairs. When this was a boarding house, the 4 rooms up here were designed to be accommodations for either an entire family or a few working men. When the buyers bought the home, these 4 rooms became bedrooms. One bedroom would have been for mom and dad and the baby. Another bedroom would have been for grandma and grandpa, or maybe an unmarried aunt. So that leaves 2 rooms for children. Pioneer families were often very large, with maybe 6 to 12 children. I see you doing the math right now. You're figuring that, all right, that might be 3 to 6 kids in one room. So we needed a variety of sizes of beds. Pioneer beds were made from materials they had, or ordered from the Sears and Roebuck catalog, which was always pretty exciting for a family. The mattresses were made with materials that were available on the farm. One of the materials that was most available was horsehair. Here's an example of horsehair. They wanted their mattresses to be as durable as possible. So you see, if I squeeze this and let it go, it comes right back to its original position. Everyone had horses, and they had to brush their horses. So rather than throw the hair away, they saved it. Once they had enough to make a mattress, they would wash it and sterilize it, let it dry, and then put it into a mattress. The outside of the mattress is covered with a stiff cotton material called ticking. The beds were covered with quilts, and these quilts were made from clothing that had been passed down and were no longer useful. As you will see, everything on the farm is used until it has no other purpose. Children rarely played in their bedrooms because, first of all, it was for beds and only for sleeping. Also, there were several dangerous things in here, like hot pipes, large windows, a kerosene lamp in the ceiling, which was lowered to light it, and it remained lowered while it was lit. When it was turned off, it would go back up to the top of the ceiling. However, children would not use kerosene lamps. The main reason was because, first of all, they could get burned. Second of all, if they dropped the lamp, it could cause a fire. Fires were a huge worry for pioneers in the 1880s. Most buildings were made of wood. So if a fire broke out, the home would most likely burn all the way to the ground. Now, children did have some playtime because they weren't spending all of their time at school and all of their time with chores. Some of the toys that children played with are similar to the toys you play with today. However, there were no toy stores, and a lot of toys were created by things that were no longer needed on the farm. An old embroidery hoop might become a game of graces. Burlap sacks could be used for sack races. The rings on a barrel could be rolled and chased. And then sometimes you had small wooden toys that were carved.
We certainly hope you enjoyed your visit with us today, and sometime soon we hope we might see you out here at the museum, where we're doing our very best to keep history alive for the future generation We know that you'll enjoy it, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you very much.